Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. You can join Brian Curtis and myself for the stories making news and moving markets in the APAC region. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.
In our studios is Jing Liu, Chief Economist for Greater China at HSBC. Jing Liu, thanks very much for coming into our studios. So we saw this report on CCTV that holiday hotel sales surged more than 60% year on year. This is just really tracking several days during the holiday period, the Spring Festival, but also said that prices of grain, edible oil, pork, meat, chicken, and eggs remain basically unchanged. So I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but when China comes back from holiday next week, are we going to be looking at it with an optimistic feeling or more pessimism?
I think the holiday spending definitely is on track to hit a record high. This is optimistic, I would say. And this is a fully normalized Spring Festival after 2019. So we see quite some pent-up demand. And this year, there's some emergence of the new spending trend, going back home for the holiday first and then going out for travel. So that's why everywhere we see people and in China, people even create a new phrase to describe the crowd.
One of the things that we talk a lot about in this program as it relates to consumer sentiment in China is not only the performance of the property market, and I choose those words very carefully because I really think that it's been underperforming in a major way. That's known. The other thing that's been happening is that the equity market has been struggling. We know that as well. And I'm wondering maybe that authorities will surprise markets before the resumption of trading on Monday. One of the writers on our MLive blog was hypothesizing about the possibility, let's say, of a cut in the one-year MLF over the weekend. That would be an unexpected positive for stocks. Is that something that could happen?
Well, actually, we don't see the MLF cut on this Sunday. We actually see most likely after Fed pivot in the second half of this year, there will be 20 basis point MLF cut. That being said, likely we're going to see the LPR cut on 20th of February. So, or at least earlier than MLF cut. I think basically we have observed recently the policymakers have stepped up their support for the economy and even for the equity market. So that is taken in an optimistic way by Chinese people.
Now, if you've been in this business as long as people like Doug and I have been, you know that things are not usually as bad as they seem in the media, and that's even we're media people. And they're not usually as good as they are sometimes portrayed as well. So we look at these reports with a bit of a grain of salt. I mentioned the one from CCTV. Citigroup also said that Macau casinos, for instance, had a pretty strong start to the holidays, with visitors up about 34% in the first 3 days. So when you look at some of these anecdotal pieces of information, does it give you hope that they can emerge from this, or is it really just overshadowed to too much of a degree by the housing and the stock market crashes?
I think, we definitely see the passenger trips increase quite a bit, both domestically and, offshore. It's also important to look at the per capita spending, and seems to be quite promising to be comparable to the 2019 level. And on top of that, we see on the housing side, there's a lot of measures being rolled out trying to stabilize the housing market. If the government, by using this new dual track model to support the housing market, then probably we'll see consumer confidence continue to recover.
I'm wondering about what's been going on with deflation. We talk so much about the inflation story in the other developed markets like the U.S. and to a lesser extent Australia, even in Europe. It's maybe a situation now where we have stalled just a bit. So maybe something that's approaching kind of stagflation. I mean, growth is still strong, so I don't want to even characterize it in that way. But I think what's unmistakable is what's happening in China is very much a deflation story. How severe is it in your view?
China is definitely an outlier on this front. But when we look at the composition of inflation, then you probably won't be as worried because the major drag came from the food prices and to a lesser extent commodity prices. And, this year, I think starting from the second half of this year, we'll see pork, an important driver for inflation and deflation in China, actually will likely, turn from deflation to inflation. That could be much less of a drag. So I think, key is still to see whether consumer confidence improves enough such that there's, the domestic demand picking up.
We have seen measures described as ineffective by the marketplace, measures that have been put in to try to stem the difficulties in the property market. If you and if HSBC had a sort of wish list for things that could be done, what would they be for China to stem the decline?
Right. I think, we give a lot of thought on this, and our view is that there need to be a more top-down coordinated measure. Now we see a lot of trials at the localized level, but at the same time, the central government rolls out this dual-track model, which basically says we are going to segregate the social housing and private housing market. And then the catch of the social housing market is that not only it can actually help, especially the lower income people, to have more spending power if they're eligible to live in social housing, but also the government will use social housing to absorb some of the oversupply on private housing. That's a way to help rebalance the market. So if I could say something, I would say, maybe do a larger scale of social housing.
Beyond the property market overall, do you think there's overregulation in China, and that is really the key problem here, that the way to reinvigorate growth is just to not only relax some of the regulations, but to send a very powerful message that these changes aren't going to be dynamic or mercurial, that once they're set, the market can comfortably rely that they will remain in place for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, that's a fair comment. We did say, we still see the lingering effect of the regulatory tightening from 2021. And we need to see more coordinated effort from the government and to assure the market the regulation is more transparent and predictable. On that front, I think it's quite interesting to see that NDRC actually came out, announced that they are going to sponsor legislation which will give the private-owned enterprises equal rights as SOEs. So if that actually materialize this year or next year, that would be another level, in a sense that people are more assured there's a legal protection with respect to the equal market access and many other things for the POEs.
Yeah, some have even said that in the state-owned enterprise sector that they could increase the dividends and try to get some of the money back into the system. But I suppose since the state is the main owner of shares of those, maybe it would be like giving the money from the left hand to the right hand. Anyway, Jing, thanks very much for joining us. Jing Liu, Chief Economist, Greater China at HSBC. Well, one of our featured stories today, Ford is saying that it sees low-cost Chinese electric vehicles as a major threat. Now, for some of the background on this, currently there's a 27.5% tariff on Chinese EVs to be sold in the United States. Thus, you're not seeing Chinese EVs circulate in the United States. But now many of the Chinese EV makers like BYD are scouting spots in Mexico so that they could take advantage of the USMCA trade agreement, which would give them access to the United States. So to discuss this now, we're joined by Danny Lee, Bloomberg's Asia Transport reporter, with us live in our studios. How real and how big and how immediate is this threat?
Well, if you're Ford, they clearly have a worry that, quote, China being a colossal strategic threat, that they're coming. Whatever the barriers that there are, in stopping the Chinese EV makers, the brands right now, from entering the US. And these comments kind of echo something that Elon Musk had touched upon earlier this year. He said that, quote, frankly, if I think there are not more trade barriers established, they will pretty much demolish most other car companies in the world. So even Elon Musk is concerned of the rise and the dominance of the Chinese automakers, and particularly when you look at how BYD, in theory, could undercut Ford right now with its own EV as cheap as $11,000 in China. But when you look at the US being around $60,000 US dollars, there's a lot of room for the Chinese automakers and EV makers to undercut the legacy US brands who have dominated the auto space for such a long time, and they're just not used to seeing the competition, and particularly out of China, who are leading the way in terms of innovation and development of EVs.
Well, the U.S. auto industry has had to deal with what happened in the 1970s with Japanese automakers, to a lesser extent what's come out of parts of Germany. But one of the things I was struck by, Danny, and I'm sure you read the piece that our Bloomberg team put together, the chief operating officer at Ford EVs unit, Maureen Jaya, was saying that essentially Chinese EV makers are ahead of in the technology space, so their technology is more advanced. Do you know what he's talking about here? Is it something beyond just the battery technology?
It's a combination of the battery technology and the technology that the way in which EVs are powered when it comes to the features, whether it be autonomous driving, to features in which drivers can be better connected to their car with for example, their phones. So there's a much more holistic ecosystem. It sounds a horrible phrase here, but it just means drivers are better connected with a whole range of features, and it just means that there's less friction when it comes to using your car as just a car. They can use it as, it feels like, just much more than that.
Well, as we heard from that chief operating officer at Ford, they're well aware of the problem now, and they're on the case. And they do have some time, because it takes a while to build a plant and to start churning out cars. How much time do they have?
Well, frankly, if there were no trade barriers today, China would be in the US market, and particularly these emerging Chinese brands, and even for the big brands like BYD, as you said, who overtook Tesla last year as the biggest EV seller. So
well, that's why I mentioned the 27.5% tariff, because that kind of prices them out to a certain degree. But they can get around that with the USMCA, but they have to build the plant. How long will it take, and can the U.S. manufacturers respond in that time?
Well, the Chinese brands, it would be at least a couple of years away, if not at least 3 years away, depending on how quickly they can pour the resources in. And we knew that from BYD speaking to Bloomberg, in fact, late last year, that they were looking at Mexico. So this is not necessarily a new point, but the fact that they have been looking for the facilities and the ways where to construct, they are already thinking about the bigger picture. And clearly Mexico, for a lot of Chinese brands and suppliers, is a key launching pad for them to get to the US.
It's a perfect segue into Elon Musk inviting some of these Chinese auto part makers into the Mexican market as a way of supplying what Tesla is hoping to do when it creates this massive production facility in Mexico, right? Do you want to weigh in on that? I mean, is this going to be something that the U.S. government is going to really kind of push back against to the extent that it can with Mr. Elon Musk?
Yeah, this is a fascinating one, but for Elon Musk, clearly, as Tesla has to grow, it has to find sites not just in the US but outside of the US where it can continue to add production, add capacity. Mexico is a clear answer here, and Mexico has been long known for auto producing, and particularly for the North American brands. So I think the US has to be careful at how it looks at Mexico. But for now, the Chinese supply chain has been a huge component of Elon Musk being able to develop. So it's just clearly an interesting one that Washington will still sit up.
And we're seeing a parallel story develop in Europe right now for the Chinese automakers. That's another story that we watch very closely. Thanks to Danny Lee, Bloomberg News. We move to this story. Indonesia's Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto declaring victory himself in the presidential vote, citing independent pollsters. And we bring in Haslinda Amin, Bloomberg Chief Southeast Asia correspondent and anchor for Bloomberg Markets Asia, for a closer look at this. So before we get to the significance of this and the implications of it, let's talk a little bit about what has to happen for this to become fact and not just Prabowo declaring victory.
Well, that's right. I mean, the official results actually will come in about a few weeks. What we've been referring to is the quick count done by independent pollsters. It is unofficial, but this quick count has been accurate for the party election. So a lot is being said right now. It shows a decisive victory for Prabowo and his running mate Gibran, who is, by the way, the incumbent President Jokowi's son. They secured almost 60% of the votes, which, by the way, is higher than what most polls predicted and better than Jokowi's own performance at the last two elections. So now it shows successful his media strategy, in particular his TikTok strategy, has been in remaking his image from a general who allegedly was involved in the killings in East Timor and Papua New Guinea, as well as the abduction of student protesters in the late 1990s. Now, I was a rookie reporter then. I remember those days. He was blacklisted by the U.S. for 2 decades, allowed to visit only recently, in fact 4 years ago. Now, obviously, it comes down to that strategy, and that's won the hearts and minds of the younger voters, because more than 50% of the 200 million voters are under 40 years old. It shows how he's won the hearts and minds, because through his media strategy, he's come across as a cuddly grandfather. His meme is of a chubby grandfather. So, when you speak to the young people around here, they say, you know what?
Okay.
People change. And what he stands for is a good economy and great jobs. And that's what he's promised the young people.
Yeah, one thing I'm curious about, though, has a little back and forth. One thing I'm curious about is, why hasn't Joko Widodo publicly declared support, given that his son is the running mate? Well,
the thing is this, right? As a president, constitutionally, he's meant to stay neutral, but obviously, has been seen with Prabowo. He's been seen supporting Prabowo and fielding his son as the vice president. That shows a lot of support for Prabowo, and hence that has become quite an issue with the people who see this as Jokowi himself trying to build a political dynasty. Yes, he's done 2 terms in office, but no, he's not leaving because his son is going to be next in power. So a lot of unease in the country.
Has, I know you have great familiarity with Indonesia, a lot of experience. I'm wondering if you can help me understand how the economy is performing. You talked about the support among the younger generation for Subianto. Give me a sense of what's happening economically that may be helping to feed some of that support among the younger generation.
Numbers don't lie. If you take a look at the last 8 years and how the JCI, the Jakarta Composite Index, has done, it surged 45%. The rupiah has been pretty stable despite the pandemic, and that shows the legacy that Joko Widodo is leaving behind. An average growth of 5%. You know what? Nothing to scream about and far, far away from that 7% goal, but it is still 5%, a growth rate that many countries, even in this part of the world, are not showing. So the country is doing pretty well. What investors want to see is stability, and they're getting that with the results of this election. What they want to see is policy continuity, and Prabowo has promised that. So you can expect policies like downstreaming, like infrastructure spending, infrastructure building, the move of the capital from Jakarta to Nusantara will continue, and that might just be enough for the JCI to surge even more and for the currency to strengthen from here.
Let's go back to the comment you made about Prabowo being banned from the U.S. for a couple of decades. That's because of alleged human rights abuses, and he's the former son-in-law of the late dictator Suharto. Is any of that cloud still following him, or is that all cleared now?
Well, when it comes to relations with the U.S., I think analysts that you speak to constructive relationship. because Indonesia plays a pivotal role in balancing the influence between the U.S. and China in this part of the world, the Indo-Pacific, as Trump himself talked about. And I think that is crucial in putting things in perspective. Also remember that Indonesia is one of the biggest exporters of the likes of coal, of nickel. And as the world moves into the EV space, as climate becomes essential, an essential conversation, and as China tries to shape and influence a lot of the regions, I think both sides, Indonesia in particular, knows what's at stake and is willing to play both sides. So I think whether Biden comes to power or whether Trump comes back to power, I think there'll be no difference in how relationships pan out from here. It will be a constructive relationship.
It's a big country, a lot of provinces that have to report. Haas, last question. How long do you think it will be before the results of this election are official?
It's going to be a couple of weeks. You talk about how large it is. Let me just put that in perspective very quickly. It is an archipelago, 17,000 islands, 700 languages, 3 different time zones, all in an area as big as the U.S. So, it was amazing that the whole election, 200 million voters, took all of 6 hours to cast their votes, and it will take a few weeks for the official results to come through.
Haas, thanks so much. I know it's a busy day for you. I appreciate you making time for us here on the radio side. Haslinda Amin, Bloomberg's Chief South Asia correspondent, also anchor of Bloomberg Markets Asia from Jakarta, Indonesia, here on Daybreak Asia.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen. And always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.